At family dinner, my own sister hit me, shoved me out, and screamed, "Get out of my home." Imagine being humiliated like that, in front of everyone you thought was family. Before I dive deeper, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. I'm always curious to see how far these stories reach. Now let's get into it. My name is Alara, I'm in my mid-20s, and for as long as I can remember, I've been the quiet one. The peacemaker. The one who swallowed her pride and let things slide because that's what my parents always asked of me. Be the bigger person, Alara. Don't make things worse. Those words have been drilled into my head since I was a kid, and I carried them like a badge of honor. At least I thought I did, until that night. It was supposed to be a nice evening. My mom's birthday. Everyone gathered around the long dining table in my sister Maribel's house, plates stacked with food, laughter echoing louder than the clinking glasses. I had brought a cake, spent half the day decorating it because I thought, just this once, maybe I could contribute something meaningful. I thought maybe they would see me, but it didn't take long before the cracks showed. As soon as I suggested we could all pitch in for a small surprise trip for Mom, Maribel rolled her eyes and smirked. "Oh, please. Like you could ever organize something like that. Let's be real, leave the planning to people who know what they're doing." The table chuckled along with her, except me. My cheeks burned, but I bit my tongue. That's what I always did. I tried to redirect, to keep peace, but Maribel wasn't done. She leaned in closer, her voice louder, sharper. "You always think you're so thoughtful, Alara, but you're just pathetic." And before I could even react, she stood up, shoved me so hard I stumbled back, and snapped, "Get out of my home." The room went silent, but not a single person moved. Not my mom, not my dad, not even my cousins who watched wide-eyed as if it were some kind of show. My chest tightened as I stood there, frozen, waiting for someone, anyone, to defend me. But no one did. My mom glanced at her plate, my dad kept chewing like nothing had happened, and Maribel just glared at me, daring me to argue. So I grabbed my bag, blinked back the tears stinging my eyes, and walked out into the cold night air. As I closed the door behind me, the laughter inside slowly picked back up, muffled through the walls. They had already moved on. To them, it was just another Alara moment, me being the outcast, the punching bag, the one they knew wouldn't fight back. But as I stood on that porch, heart pounding, I realized something. That shove wasn't just a push out of her house. It was a push out of the life I'd been clinging to, the family I thought I needed. For the first time, I felt the sting of humiliation turn into something else, a quiet, simmering anger. And deep down, I knew that night wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Growing up, I always felt like I was standing in the shadows of my sister, Maribel. She was the one who could do no wrong, the one who always got the praise, the gifts, the attention. When we were kids and she broke something, it was me who was told to apologize for causing trouble. When she lashed out, the excuse was that I needed to be more mature, that I shouldn't provoke her. My parents never hid their favoritism, even if they pretended it wasn't obvious. Maribel was their pride, and I was the one told to keep the peace. That night at dinner was no different. I had been sitting quietly, trying to be part of the celebration without stepping on any toes. It was supposed to be a happy evening for Mom's birthday, and I thought maybe suggesting something simple would make her feel special. I brought up the idea of everyone chipping in for a small getaway, just a weekend somewhere peaceful for her to relax. My voice was calm, hopeful even, but before I could even finish explaining, Maribel cut in with a smirk. "Really, Alara? You think you're in a position to suggest that? You can't even handle your own life, but you want to plan for everyone else." She tilted her head, her tone dripping with mockery. The worst part wasn't just her words. It was the way the table leaned into her laughter, like they were waiting for her punchline. I sat there, my face heating, but I refused to back down. I tried to explain that it wasn't about me, that it was about Mom, but Maribel raised her voice, drowning mine out. "You always act like you're trying, but it's pathetic. Just stop embarrassing yourself." Her words landed sharp and heavy, and I could feel every pair of eyes on me. I thought maybe if I stayed calm, she would lose interest, but instead she stood up, looming over me. Her hand slammed against the table, rattling the dishes, and then in a flash she shoved me hard enough that my chair scraped backward. Gasps filled the room, but no one moved. "Leave and never come back," she screamed, her face twisted with rage. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I looked to my parents, hoping for some sign that they would step in, but my father kept his eyes on his plate, and my mother stayed silent. I stood slowly, the weight of the room pressing against me, and felt the sting of betrayal deepen with every second that passed. No one came to my defense, not even the people who should have loved me most. Maribel's voice still echoed in my head as I walked toward the door, her words final and cruel. Leave and never come back. I stumbled down the front steps, barely aware of where I was going, only that I needed to put as much distance between myself and that house as possible. The cold air hit my face, but it did nothing to stop the hot tears streaming down. Each step felt heavier, as though I was dragging the weight of every year I had been silenced, every moment I had been brushed aside. My chest burned, not from the shove itself, but from what followed silence. Not a single voice rose in my defense. The sound of the door shutting behind me echoed like a final verdict. They let me go without a word, as though I had been disposable all along. I had always thought deep down that my parents loved me in their own way, even if they never showed it the same way they did with Maribel. But standing out there in the dark, it became painfully clear. Their silence was a choice. A choice to side with her, to leave me standing alone. I wrapped my arms around myself, as if to shield against the hollow ache forming inside me. It wasn't just about being shoved. If it had only been that, maybe I could have brushed it off, told myself it was just another argument. But the image of my mother looking away and my father pretending nothing happened replayed over and over in my mind. That cut deeper than Maribel's hands ever could. Their silence screamed louder than any insult. Every tear that fell only seemed to fuel something I hadn't felt before. Betrayal dug its claws in, sharper than humiliation, and underneath it, a quiet fury started to take shape. I had been conditioned to swallow everything, to move on without making waves. But in that moment I realized what that had cost me. Years of being the one who stayed quiet, the one who sacrificed her own dignity to keep the family intact, had only left me abandoned when I needed them most. I stopped at the end of the street, gasping for breath, the night sky blurred by tears. A part of me wanted to run back, to scream, to demand why they couldn't stand up for me. But another part, stronger than I expected, held me back. Why beg for love that was never freely given? Why keep seeking protection from people who had already shown I wasn't worth defending? The anger didn't roar. It simmered slow and steady, like embers refusing to die out. It settled deep in my chest, quiet but unshakable. They had made it clear where I stood, and I finally saw them for what they were. Not a family, not in the way I had hoped. Just people who shared my blood but not my loyalty, not my heart. As I walked farther away, my tears dried, replaced by something colder. I had been cast out, humiliated, left to stand alone. But that night, beneath the ache, a new resolve was born. If they wanted me gone, they would see just what it meant to live without me. Walking alone that night, memories I had tried so hard to bury began to claw their way back. The sting of Maribel's shove wasn't new. It was only the most recent version of something I had lived with since childhood. I could still see her smirking as she snatched my things, like it was her right to take whatever she wanted from me. I remembered opening my drawers to find favorite clothes missing, toys gone, books bent and tossed aside in her room. Whenever I worked up the courage to complain, the answer was always the same. Don't start a fight. Be the bigger person. That phrase became a chain around my neck, tightening every time I dared to resist. When she broke my headphones, it was me who was told to share. When she lied and blamed me for something she had done, I was told not to argue. The pattern was always there. Maribel was excused, and I was expected to endure. It wasn't about fairness. It was about keeping her happy at my expense. Even now, years later, I could hear my parents' voices as if they were right beside me. Let it go, Alara. You're older, you should know better. As if age meant I was destined to absorb every slight, every insult, every injustice without complaint. They never once asked how it felt to constantly give in. They never once stopped to see how much it hurt to watch her get away with everything while I was scolded for wanting even the smallest bit of respect. The dinner had only peeled back a layer I had been pretending wasn't there. Maribel's rage, her shove, her demand that I leave. It wasn't out of nowhere. It was the same story playing out again, just louder, sharper, more public. The silence of my parents at that table wasn't new either. It was simply consistent with every moment they had chosen her side before. Only this time, it was impossible to convince myself it was harmless. As I walked, I realized the truth. This wasn't one bad night. It wasn't about a ruined birthday or a petty argument. It was the result of years of being dismissed, ignored, and treated as though my feelings were disposable. That house, that family, had been telling me the same thing my entire life. I didn't matter as much as she did. The memories stung, but they also made something clear. I hadn't been imagining it, and I wasn't overreacting. That night wasn't an isolated crack. It was the breaking point of a wall that had been crumbling for years. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. In the days that followed, I didn't explode or make a dramatic announcement. I did the opposite. I went quiet. Instead of reaching out, instead of explaining my side or begging to be heard, I pulled back and simply observed. I stopped rushing to return calls, stopped trying to patch up the cracks that had never really healed. I watched from a distance, and for the first time, I wasn't blinded by the need to be accepted. What stood out almost immediately was the truth behind Maribel's show of confidence. She liked to present herself as untouchable, the one who had everything figured out, but I started noticing the slips. Little comments she made about overdue bills, hints about money being tight, the way she complained about work without realizing how much she was revealing. Her superiority was a mask, and underneath it was stress she couldn't hide forever. At the same time, I became more aware of my parents' quiet reliance on me. It wasn't always direct, but the signs were there. The small favors they asked for had always been financial in nature. Help with a bill, covering a repair, pitching in when something came up. They had grown so used to me stepping in that they didn't even think twice about it. It wasn't just generosity on my part. It had become their expectation. And without realizing it, I had been holding up more of the structure than I ever thought. As I stepped back, I began to see the imbalance clearly. Maribel had the affection and excuses, but I had the stability. My parents leaned on me in ways they never acknowledged, and my sister's pedestal was built on appearances she could barely sustain. It hit me slowly but firmly. I had far more influence than I'd believed. The realization didn't bring a rush of triumph. It brought calm. I no longer felt the frantic urge to prove myself or demand fairness. Instead, I sat with the knowledge that the people who treated me as expendable were, in fact, tethered to me in ways they hadn't even admitted to themselves. And for the first time, I saw that stepping back wasn't weakness, it was control. I didn't need to cut them off in a blaze of anger. I only needed to stop giving so freely, and the imbalance would reveal itself. That shift inside me was subtle but powerful. I stopped feeling like the powerless one, the overlooked sibling, the scapegoat. I started to recognize the quiet leverage I had been carrying all along. It wasn't revenge, not yet. It was simply awareness, and that awareness changed everything. My first steps weren't loud or dramatic. They were quiet, almost invisible at first. I didn't announce anything, didn't confront anyone. I just stopped doing the things they had come to take for granted. When the familiar calls came, little emergencies, that always somehow required me to pull out my wallet, I no longer rushed to fix them. Instead, I listened, offered nothing, and let the silence sit. Where I once would have jumped in with a solution, I simply said, "I'm sure you'll figure it out." The change extended beyond money. For years, I had been the one who rearranged my schedule to drive them places, handle their errands, pick up the slack wherever it appeared. I told myself I was being dependable, but all it did was make me their safety net. So I stopped. When they hinted at needing help, I politely declined. "I can't," I'd say flatly, no explanation offered. It was subtle, but the absence of my effort began to show. Even in conversations, I pulled back. Where I used to listen for hours, absorbing complaints and drama, I now kept my answers short, clipped. If they asked how I was, I gave them one sentence. If they launched into long monologues, I didn't fill the gaps with my usual reassurances. I let the pauses stretch until they grew uncomfortable. My detachment became its own kind of message, one they didn't know how to interpret. At first, they brushed it off. Maybe they thought I was just busy. Maybe they assumed I would eventually go back to being the reliable one. But the longer it continued, the more obvious it became that something had shifted. The easy access they once had to me was gone, and the weight of my absence started to settle in. I could feel their frustration between the lines of their words. Small comments slipped through, questions asked in sharper tones, like they were trying to bait me back into my old role. But I stayed steady, calm, unmoved. For once, I didn't let guilt drag me into fixing things. I let them sit with the inconvenience of not having me at their disposal. It wasn't vengeance in the dramatic sense, no explosions, no screaming matches, but it was effective. They had built a rhythm around my constant availability, and removing that rhythm left them off balance. Each day I withheld what I used to give so freely, they noticed more. And though I didn't gloat, a quiet satisfaction came from watching the shift. The power I had always been told I lacked was finally showing itself, not in words, but in absence. It started with hushed calls, voices heavy with worry. My father's health had taken a sudden turn, and soon after, the weight of medical costs began pressing down on them. The bills grew faster than they could manage, and the fear in their voices was unmistakable. Still, when they reached out, their tone carried the same assumption it always had, that I would step in like before and take care of it. Maribel was the first to bring it up directly. She called one evening, her voice sharp with urgency, but laced with expectation. "We need you to help cover Dad's treatment. You know how serious this is. Just do what you always do." It wasn't a question, it was a command, delivered as if the past hadn't happened, as if my place in the family was to provide without hesitation. When I didn't answer immediately, my mother chimed in days later, her words softer but no less entitled. She reminded me of all the times I had been there for them, painting it as though it was my responsibility to continue, as though that role had been carved into me permanently. My silence unsettled her, but she still believed I would fold. They all did. The moment came when we sat across from one another at the table, the weight of my father's illness thick in the air. Maribel looked at me like she was already frustrated I hadn't pulled out my checkbook, while my parents stared as if waiting for me to play my part. I let the quiet stretch before speaking, my voice calm, steady, free of any tremor. "Why?" I asked plainly. "I'm not part of this family anymore, remember?" The words landed harder than I expected. For the first time, there was no instant rebuttal, no barrage of guilt or accusations. Just silence. My mother's mouth opened, then closed again. My father looked down, unable to meet my eyes. Even Maribel, always so quick to snap, froze in place, her confidence faltering. The entitlement that had always filled the space between us seemed to evaporate in that single moment. I didn't raise my voice, didn't push further. I simply let the truth sit there, hanging between us, undeniable. They had made their choice when they stood by as I was thrown out, when they let Maribel's cruelty define my place in the family. And now they were feeling the weight of that choice. For the first time, I wasn't the one shrinking under their expectations. They were the ones staring at the void I had left. The silence that followed wasn't just empty. It was heavy, suffocating, filled with the realization that I was no longer theirs to rely on. The shift didn't happen overnight, but it was steady and impossible to miss. Without me stepping in, the weight that had once been carried quietly on my shoulders began pressing down on them. Maribel, who had always paraded around as if she had everything under control, started to slip. Little by little, the strain showed. Missed payments, late notices, tension in her voice when she thought no one was listening. Her polished image began to fracture, and there was no one left to hold it together for her. My parents, who once turned a blind eye to her behavior, could no longer ignore the reality. The strain of bills piling higher than they could handle became a daily fight. At first, the arguments were whispered, behind closed doors. But soon the walls couldn't contain them. Raised voices spilled into the open, sharp accusations thrown back and forth. I heard from extended relatives that my mother had snapped at Maribel, saying she was the reason I had walked away. My father, normally silent, had apparently shouted that she had destroyed the family's balance. Maribel, unaccustomed to being on the receiving end, lashed out in return. She blamed them for depending too much on me, for letting things reach this point. She refused to take responsibility, as she always had, but the deflection didn't land the same way anymore. The foundation that had once kept her untouchable was gone, and the cracks widened with every passing week. I didn't intervene. I didn't reach out. I didn't offer solutions. I kept my distance, watching from afar as the unraveling took shape. There was no satisfaction in their arguments, no joy in their stress, only a quiet recognition that this was the natural result of years of imbalance. They had built their world around Maribel's pedestal and my silence, and once I stepped away, the structure collapsed under its own weight. The calls grew fewer, shorter, more strained. Where there had once been demands, now there was hesitation. They knew better than to ask again, but the distance between them and me stretched wider each day. I didn't fill it. I let it remain, a reminder of the choices they had made. I stayed still, calm, detached, while their lives twisted around the void I left behind. And as their voices rose in conflict, I only grew quieter, watching the cracks deepen until the family I once tried so desperately to protect no longer resembled the one I had known. Peace came slowly, not as a sudden burst of joy, but as a steady calm that began filling the spaces once consumed by pain. I didn't wake up celebrating their struggles, nor did I sit back with a sense of triumph. What I found instead was relief, quiet, steady, undeniable relief. For the first time in years, my days weren't dictated by their needs, their demands, or their chaos. I began leaning into new connections, people who valued me without condition. Friends who checked in not because they wanted something, but because they cared. With them, I laughed freely, shared meals, created memories that weren't tainted by obligation. Slowly, I realized I was building something different, something stronger than what I had tried to cling to before. It wasn't the family I was born into, it was the family I chose, and in that choice I found comfort. Meanwhile, word trickled back about the growing storm within my old household. Arguments that never seemed to end, bitterness that seeped into every interaction. The harmony they once pretended to have was gone, replaced by tension too loud to hide. Each update came to me not as a wound, but as confirmation. They were reaping what they had sown, and I was no longer part of it. Still, I didn't feel joy at their unraveling. There was no gloating, no desire to rub salt into their wounds. What I felt was bittersweet, a release I had long craved but never thought I would truly taste. Their downfall didn't make me happy, but it freed me. I no longer carried the responsibility of holding them together, no longer bore the weight of being their unacknowledged support. In the quiet moments, I sometimes thought of what could have been if things had been different, if love had been given freely instead of conditionally. But those thoughts no longer ached the way they once did. They were simply reflections, passing and harmless. My focus was no longer on what I had lost, but on what I was gaining: peace, respect, and the strength to live without the chains that once bound me. It was in that calm that I finally understood. My freedom wasn't about their collapse. It was about my choice to walk away and not look back. Their resentment belonged to them. My peace belonged to me. Looking back now, I see that the night I was shoved out wasn't the moment I lost everything. It was the moment I finally began to reclaim myself. For so long, I thought endurance was strength, that staying quiet meant keeping peace. But real strength came when I chose to step away, when I stopped allowing myself to be treated as less. That night was not an ending. It was the start of freedom. I came to understand that family isn't about who shares your blood. It's about who shows up with respect, with care, with love that doesn't demand silence in return. The people who truly matter are the ones who make space for you, not the ones who erase you to protect their favorites. My greatest act of defiance wasn't shouting, wasn't fighting, wasn't trying to win them over. It was leaving. It was choosing not to carry their burdens anymore. It was letting them feel the emptiness I once filled and realizing, too late, that they had taken me for granted. Sometimes the deepest revenge requires no anger at all. It's simply living your life without them and knowing they must live with the consequences of pushing you away. Sometimes the best revenge is simply letting people live without you and realizing too late how much you mattered. Do you think I made the right choice by walking away, or should I have stayed and given them another chance? I'd really love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective means a lot. And if you want to hear more of my stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.